I never thought a wedding could turn into a test of power. A few weeks before the date, Daniel asked me to come with him to his parents' house. He said they wanted to talk about details. I expected questions about flowers or the guest list. Instead, I walked into a room that felt cold and serious, like a business meeting. Daniel's parents, Richard and Elaine Whitmore, sat across from me with tight smiles. There was a folder on the table, neatly stacked, already opened. I remember noticing how calm they looked, as if they had practiced this moment. Elaine slid the papers closer to me without asking how I was feeling. Richard cleared his throat and said this was something they required before any marriage in their family. As I skimmed the pages, my stomach sank. It wasn't just legal language. It was control, written in fine print. The document made it clear that no matter what happened in the future, I would walk away with nothing. Not just money, no security, no voice, no respect. It felt like I was being told exactly where I stood. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to speak. He avoided my eyes. That hurt more than anything his parents said. I had always believed we were a team. In that moment, I felt alone in a room full of people who had already decided my place. Elaine leaned forward and said they needed an answer soon. The wedding plans were expensive, she reminded me, and their family reputation mattered. Richard added that love was important, but being practical mattered more. They spoke as if I were a risk that needed to be managed, not a person joining their family. My chest felt tight, but I stayed quiet. I didn't want to cry or argue. I wanted to understand how everything had changed so quickly. Just months ago, they welcomed me with polite warmth. Now, I could feel the conditions behind every word they spoke. On the drive home, Daniel finally said something. He told me his parents were old-fashioned and this was just how they did things. He asked me to be patient and said signing would make everything easier. He promised nothing would change between us. But something already had. Trust doesn't break loudly. Sometimes it cracks in silence, when the person you love chooses comfort over standing up for you. I realized no one in that room had asked what I wanted or how I felt. They only cared about protecting what was theirs. That night, I sat alone and thought about the future they were offering me. A life where I would always be reminded of my place. A marriage that started with pressure instead of partnership. They believed I would accept it because I loved Daniel and didn't want to lose the wedding. They were sure I would bend. They didn't know me as well as they thought. I met Daniel at a charity event a few years ago, and there was something about him that felt different from anyone I had ever known. He was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in what I had to say. We connected quickly, talking about dreams, family, and the small things that mattered. Over time, our friendship grew into something deeper, and I believed we had built our relationship on honesty and trust. I felt safe sharing my hopes and fears with him, and I thought he felt the same. When he proposed, it felt like everything I had imagined was finally coming true. I pictured us building a life together, making decisions as a team, and supporting each other through challenges. I didn't see warning signs back then, not in the early days, when Daniel's parents seemed polite and welcoming. They smiled at me at first, complimented my career, and asked about my family. Everything seemed normal, even warm. But as the wedding plans started, something began to shift. Richard and Elaine, who had seemed so kind at the start, started quietly steering decisions in ways I didn't expect. They offered suggestions that quickly became demands. They told us which caterer to hire, what colors to use, and even who should sit at the head table. At first, I brushed it off, thinking they just wanted to help. I didn't want to cause tension, so I agreed to small things, assuming it was part of being polite. Soon, I realized it wasn't small. They questioned every choice, insisting we do things their way, and it felt less like advice and more like control. Daniel, who had always seemed so independent and supportive, began to step back, letting his parents lead. He said it was easier to let them have their way than to argue, and I tried to understand. But every decision we made together started to feel like it wasn't really ours. It hurt to see the person I loved, who had promised partnership and respect, silently giving in to his parents' wishes. I began to notice that their control wasn't about making the wedding perfect, it was about proving power, about showing that they could dictate our lives. The more they pushed, the more I felt trapped, and the trust one thought we shared began to feel fragile. By the time the first formal meeting about the prenup came, I realized this was bigger than a wedding. This was about how much influence they could have over my life, even before I was officially part of the family. What had started as love and excitement was now tangled with control and manipulation. I loved Daniel, but I also saw the hard truth. Their family wasn't just guiding the wedding, they were testing me, and testing whether I would allow them to take over everything I cared about. When the prenup first landed on the table, I thought it would be simple, standard legal protection. Most people I knew had them, and I understood the idea behind it, making sure both partners were protected. But as I started reading, my heart sank. This document was unlike any I had seen before. It wasn't about fairness or balance. It wasn't about protecting either of us. It was about taking everything from me. Every clause seemed designed to strip away my rights. It wasn't just financial, it felt personal. I would have no say in property we bought together, no claim if anything went wrong, and even my own savings could be questioned. More than that, it sent a clear message: I was not an equal. My future, my security, my independence, all of it could be erased if I signed. The words on the page made me feel smaller than I had ever felt in my life. I turned to Daniel, hoping he would stop this, hoping he would stand up for me. He hesitated. I saw the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to support me, but he also wanted peace with his family. After a long silence, he finally said, "Emily, maybe you should just sign it. It will make things easier." The words felt like a knife. Easier for who? For me, or for them? I wanted to scream that this wasn't about ease, it was about control, about bending me to their will. Daniel tried to explain that his parents didn't mean harm, that this was just their way, that it didn't reflect how he felt. But their influence was clear. The prenup wasn't just a document. It was a test, a boundary they had drawn to remind me that nothing in this relationship was truly mine until I proved I would obey. And Daniel, the person I had trusted most, was asking me to cross that boundary alone. I spent that night staring at the papers, thinking about what signing would mean. It wasn't just a signature, it was giving up part of myself, my dignity, and the freedom I had fought for all my life. I thought about my family, my achievements, and everything I had worked for. I realized I couldn't let anyone, not even the person I loved, make me feel powerless. I also understood something else: this wasn't just about the prenup. It was about a deeper problem, about who had control in this relationship. Love should be about partnership and trust, not fear and compliance. I knew I had to make a decision, but it couldn't be one that sacrificed my self-respect. Daniel might have wanted peace, but I needed justice, fairness, and recognition that I was an equal in this relationship. The prenup had crossed a line, and now I had to decide how far I was willing to go to protect myself. A few days after the prenup meeting, I went to Daniel's parents' house to pick up some wedding invitations. I thought it would be a normal, brief visit, but I wasn't expecting to overhear something that would change everything. As I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, I heard voices coming from the study. I paused, curious but uneasy, and that's when I caught snippets of a conversation that made my stomach drop. Richard was speaking first, his tone sharp and cold. "I just don't know if she's the right fit," he said. Elaine's laugh followed, light but cruel. "She's fine for now, but if she can't handle the situation, we'll find someone else. There are plenty of options." I froze. They weren't talking about helping us, they were talking about replacing me, as if I were a temporary piece in their plan. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding, but I heard more. They discussed how much influence they needed to maintain over Daniel, how they wanted to ensure the family's wealth and reputation stayed intact. My feelings, my love, my commitment, it didn't matter to them. In their eyes, I was just a stepping stone, someone who could be replaced if convenient. At that moment, the engagement didn't feel like love at all. It felt like a business deal. Every smile, every compliment, every polite gesture I had received was calculated. Everything had been about control and appearances, not about me or the man I loved. I realized how little they truly valued me as a person. I left quietly, pretending I hadn't heard anything, but inside, I was reeling. Daniel had no idea, at least not yet. I knew if he did, he would be devastated too, but I couldn't tell him just yet. The betrayal wasn't public, it was private, hidden behind closed doors, and that made it sting even more. I kept thinking about all the times I had tried to please them, all the small compromises I had made to avoid conflict. I had believed that showing respect and kindness would earn their acceptance. Now I understood it would never be enough. They didn't want a daughter-in-law, they wanted someone they could control. That night, I sat in my apartment, replaying the conversation over and over in my mind. Every word cut deeper than the last. The love I thought we shared was suddenly overshadowed by the cold reality of manipulation. I realized I had to start seeing things clearly, to understand the people I was dealing with. This wasn't just about Daniel's parents being strict or old-fashioned, it was about them seeing me as replaceable, someone without real power or worth in their world. From that moment on, I knew I had to protect myself. I couldn't let them decide my value or my future. The engagement had turned into a lesson in betrayal, and I had to figure out how to respond before it was too late. People always saw me as independent, but no one really knew the full story. I grew up learning to work hard and take care of myself. My parents weren't controlling, but they expected me to be responsible and smart about money and life. I made sacrifices early on, choosing to focus on my career and education rather than chasing fleeting pleasures. I worked long hours, saved diligently, and invested wisely, building a life I could stand on my own. Even though I appeared ordinary to most people, I quietly managed significant assets. I inherited wealth from my family, not enough to be flaunted but enough to give me security and freedom. Over the years, careful decisions, smart investments, and patience grew that inheritance into something substantial, over $15 million. It wasn't something I broadcasted, because I wanted people to respect me for who I was, not what I had. That included Daniel. I had never told him the full truth because I didn't want money to define our relationship. When I think about my life, I realize how many sacrifices I made to reach this point. I turned down opportunities that didn't align with my goals. I prioritized stability over excitement. I built a career that gave me independence, yet I stayed humble, blending in, never drawing attention to what I could achieve financially. It was my quiet power, a shield I kept for myself in a world that often underestimated women. Looking back, it becomes clear why the prenup and the Whitmore's demands angered me so much. They assumed I was powerless, that I could be controlled, and that I had no leverage. They saw only the woman they wanted to fit into their plan, not the person I truly was. They didn't know I had the means to protect myself and the strength to make decisions that no one could override. Even Daniel didn't know the full extent of what I had. I loved him, but I had kept this secret because I wanted our relationship to be built on trust and connection, not money or influence. The revelation of my wealth and independence would not be a tool to manipulate, but a statement: I wasn't someone to be coerced or underestimated. That truth gave me clarity and power. It reminded me that while others tried to impose their will, I had the ability to make my own choices, protect my dignity, and take control of my future. I had earned everything I had, and no one, not even the Whitmores, could take that away. I realized my strength had been there all along, I just needed the moment to show it. In that quiet understanding, I felt a sense of calm. I knew I wasn't helpless, and I wasn't a pawn. I was Emily Carter, and I had the resources, the intelligence, and the courage to face anyone who tried to undermine me. The engagement might have been complicated, but I had something far more important: the power to protect myself and decide my own path. After everything I had learned, I knew reacting with anger would only make things worse. The Whitmores expected resistance or tears. Instead, I chose calm. I told Daniel I was willing to move forward and that I wanted to understand the prenup better. That small shift changed everything. His parents relaxed. They believed the pressure had worked. I agreed to meet their lawyer and asked polite questions. I took notes. I nodded at the right moments. I let them explain clauses that were clearly written to protect only one side. Richard looked satisfied, and Elaine became warmer, almost friendly. They thought I was finally falling in line. What they didn't know was that I was listening very carefully. Privately, I contacted my own legal team. Not through Daniel, and not through anyone connected to his family. I chose people who worked only for me. I shared every document, every email, every condition that had been placed on me. They reviewed everything in detail and explained my options clearly, without fear or pressure. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. I continued to play my part. I attended meetings, responded kindly to messages, and never showed doubt. When Daniel asked how I was feeling, I told him I was processing things and wanted peace before the wedding. He seemed relieved and stopped asking questions. That silence told me more than words ever could. Behind the scenes, I gathered information. I learned what mattered most to the Whitmores, what they feared, and how they protected themselves. I studied timelines and obligations. I made sure every step I took was careful and legal. This wasn't about revenge driven by emotion. It was about balance and truth. The more I cooperated, the more confident they became. Elaine even thanked me for being reasonable. Richard spoke about the future as if it were already settled. They believed they had secured control and that I had accepted my role. Their confidence made them careless, and that worked in my favor. At night, I reviewed everything quietly, planning what would come next. I wasn't rushing. I understood that timing mattered. I needed the right moment, when the truth would be impossible to ignore. Until then, I stayed composed and focused. Pretending wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to speak out, to confront Daniel or expose his parents immediately. But I knew that acting too soon would only give them room to twist the story. I needed clarity, strength, and preparation. By the time the final meetings were scheduled, I was ready. The Whitmores believed they had won. Daniel believed the conflict was behind us. No one suspected that my silence was not surrender. It was strategy. And when the moment came, everything they thought they controlled was about to shift. The day of the wedding rehearsal arrived, and everything looked perfect on the surface. The venue was elegant, the decorations were exactly as planned, and everyone was dressed with care. To anyone watching, it would have seemed like a happy moment before a beautiful wedding. But underneath that polished image, the air felt heavy. Richard and Elaine moved through the space with quiet confidence. They spoke to the planner as if they owned the place, correcting small details and giving instructions without hesitation. There was a sense of pride in their voices, as if they had successfully completed a deal. Their smiles weren't warm. They were satisfied. They believed everything was finally under control. I stood beside Daniel during the walkthrough. He was polite and calm, but I noticed the tension in his shoulders. He could feel that something wasn't right, even if he couldn't name it. A few times, he looked at me as if he wanted to ask a question, but each time he stopped himself. Instead, he nodded along with his parents and stayed quiet. During the rehearsal dinner, the mood became even clearer. Richard made a short speech about tradition and family values, emphasizing how important it was to protect what has been built. Elaine added comments about how compromise was necessary in marriage. Their words were directed at me, even if they didn't say my name. It felt like a reminder of who held the power. People laughed politely, but I felt the tension at the table. I noticed how Daniel didn't defend me or challenge them. He smiled faintly, choosing comfort over conflict. I could see the struggle in him, but he chose the easier path, silence. That silence spoke louder than any argument. As the evening went on, the Whitmores became more relaxed, almost celebratory. They exchanged glances that suggested victory. To them, the hard part was over. They believed I had accepted their terms and that the future would unfold exactly as they planned. Daniel pulled me aside briefly and asked if I was okay. His voice was low, careful. I told him I was fine and that everything would work out. He seemed relieved by my answer, even though he still looked uneasy. He didn't press further. In that moment, I understood something clearly: he wanted peace more than truth. The rehearsal ended with final instructions and polite goodbyes. As people began to leave, I watched the Whitmores walk away confidently, already talking about the next day as if it were guaranteed. They didn't look back. I stood there quietly, taking everything in. The tension, the silence, the choices being made around me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I knew exactly where everyone stood, including Daniel. The setup was complete. Everyone was playing their role, unaware that the story they thought they were finishing was about to turn in a way they never expected. The final meeting was held in a quiet conference room the morning before the wedding. The mood was confident, almost relaxed. Richard and Elaine arrived early, dressed sharply, carrying themselves like people who expected a routine win. Their lawyer sat beside them, the same thick folder placed neatly on the table. Daniel sat next to me, calm but distant, as if he just wanted everything finished. Elaine smiled and said this was the last step before we could all move forward. She spoke as if the outcome was already decided. The papers were pushed toward me, and a pen was placed carefully in front of my seat. For a brief moment, everyone watched, waiting for me to sign. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed my own folder on the table. The room went quiet. I calmly explained that before I signed anything, I wanted them to review my documents. Richard looked confused, then irritated. Their lawyer hesitated but accepted the folder. As he flipped through the pages, his expression slowly changed. The confidence in the room began to fade. The documents were clear. They showed my independent assets, long-term investments, and legal protections that had been in place for years. There was no emotion in the paperwork, only facts. Numbers. Ownership. Control. The total value was undeniable. I didn't raise my voice or show anger. I simply let the truth sit in the open. Elaine's smile disappeared. Richard asked sharply why they were seeing this now. I explained that I had never been against a fair agreement, but what they had presented was not about protection. It was about dominance. I slid a second document forward, a counter prenup prepared by my legal team. This agreement was balanced. It protected both sides equally. It also clearly outlined boundaries, limits on family interference, and consequences for coercion. It reflected respect, not fear. Their lawyer read in silence. The longer he read, the clearer it became that their position was weak. Daniel looked stunned. This was the first time he truly understood how much I had been carrying on my own. He tried to speak but stopped, realizing how little he had known. The room felt smaller, heavier. Richard accused me of trying to embarrass them. I replied calmly that the only thing being exposed was intent. They had assumed I had nothing. They had pushed because they believed I had no choice. They were wrong. There was no shouting. No drama. Just reality. The meeting ended without signatures. The power had shifted completely. The control they believed they held was gone, replaced by silence and discomfort. I gathered my documents, stood up, and walked out with steady steps, knowing that nothing after that moment would ever be the same again. The fallout began almost immediately. By the end of the day, it was clear the wedding could not go forward. What was supposed to be a celebration turned into quiet cancellations and uncomfortable phone calls. The venue was notified. Vendors were paused. No public announcement was made at first, but people noticed. A wedding that had been planned so carefully didn't just disappear without questions. The Whitmores were not prepared for the consequences. Their lawyer advised caution, reminding them that pushing further could expose them to legal trouble. The agreements they had tried to force were now under review, and their approach raised concerns that could not be ignored. What they had believed was a position of strength suddenly looked reckless. Within their circles, whispers began. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just enough to damage the image they worked so hard to protect. People talked about a broken engagement, about documents that didn't sit right, about a family that may have overreached. Reputation doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes quietly, piece by piece. Financially, things were no longer smooth. Deposits were lost. Legal consultations increased. Deals that once came easily slowed down as trust wavered. The same confidence Richard and Elaine once carried now felt forced. They avoided questions and limited contact, retreating into damage control. Daniel, meanwhile, struggled in silence. When everything stopped, he finally understood what had happened. Not just the end of a wedding, but the loss of a partner who had stood strong while he stayed quiet. He reached out, confused and shaken, asking why I hadn't told him everything sooner. The truth was painful but simple. I had been waiting for him to choose me on his own. He admitted he had been afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of disappointing his parents. In choosing comfort, he had lost something irreplaceable. Regret doesn't always come with drama. Sometimes it comes in quiet moments, when it's already too late to fix what was broken. There were no public scenes, no arguments played out in front of others. Just distance. Just clarity. I stepped away fully, cutting ties cleanly and without cruelty. I didn't need apologies that came after the damage was done. The Whitmores stopped reaching out when they realized control was no longer possible. Daniel stopped when he realized love couldn't survive without courage. What remained was a clear line between what I would accept and what I would never allow again. The wedding was over before it began, but the lesson lasted longer. Power built on pressure always collapses when faced with truth. And loyalty delayed is loyalty denied. I walked away without regret, knowing that what I lost was not love, but an illusion that had finally been exposed. When everything was finally quiet, I had time to think clearly. The noise, the pressure, and the expectations were gone. What remained was my sense of self. I hadn't lost it along the way, and that mattered more than any wedding ever could. I walked away with my dignity intact, and that was not something anyone could take from me. Betrayal has a way of changing how you see the world. It strips away comfort and forces honesty. I learned that love without respect is fragile, and commitment without courage is empty. I had believed that patience and understanding would be enough, but I now understood that real partnership requires action, not silence. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt clarity. I saw how easily affection can be confused with obligation, and how quickly boundaries disappear when you don't defend them. The experience taught me that knowing your worth isn't about proving anything to others. It's about refusing to accept less than you deserve, even when walking away is painful. My life didn't fall apart because the wedding ended. In many ways, it opened up. I returned to my routines, my work, and the things that grounded me. I felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't noticed was finally gone. I trusted myself again, and that trust was powerful. I also understood that strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience, planning, and choosing the right moment to speak. I hadn't raised my voice or acted out of anger, but my choices spoke clearly. They showed that control fails when met with calm confidence. I kept my independence, my security, and my future. But more importantly, I kept my self-respect. No relationship is worth sacrificing that. Love should feel safe, not conditional. It should add to your life, not shrink it. Walking away wasn't a loss. It was a decision to protect who I am and what I built. I didn't need approval from people who never truly saw me. I didn't need to fight to be valued. What I carried forward wasn't anger or regret. It was knowledge. Knowledge of my strength. Knowledge of my boundaries. Knowledge that the right love will never ask you to give up your voice to keep the peace. I walked away stronger, not because I won something over others, but because I chose myself. And that choice changed everything.